The hangar at Hill Global Aviation smelled like jet fuel and burnt coffee before 7 in the morning, which was when the real work started. Pilots ran through checklists out of habit more than necessity. Executives rehearsed the same 3 lines they would use on investors the next week. And in the far corner, past the polished floors nobody outside management ever walked on, a man in stained coveralls checked a torque wrench against a list nobody had asked him to keep. No one in that boardroom knew his name yet. By sundown, they would wish they had learned it sooner. Because in the next few hours, one decision, made by a woman who was used to being right, was going to cost that company more than money. It was going to cost them the one thing money couldn't buy back: the trust of every pilot who had ever climbed into one of their planes. Here was what nobody at Hill Global saw coming. A CEO who read a person before she ever read their work. A father who had already survived worse than public humiliation and wouldn't waste his breath proving it. And a hangar full of professionals who were about to decide, without a single meeting or memo, that they would rather ground a fleet than fly for a company that couldn't tell the difference between a man's coveralls and his character. The question wasn't whether Raphael Williams was good enough. Every pilot in that building already knew the answer. The question was what happened to a company when its CEO refused to. Raphael's day started 3 hours before anyone at headquarters woke up. His house was small, the kind with a porch light that had been flickering since spring, and by 5:30 the kitchen smelled like eggs, and the coffee he never finished because there wasn't time. His daughter Anna was 9, sharp as anything, and she talked through breakfast about whatever she had read the night before, while he braided her hair with hands still stiff from the day before. He had learned to braid hair from videos he watched at midnight 5 years earlier, back when he was raising a daughter and grieving a wife in the same house at the same time. Nobody taught him. He figured it out because there was no one else who was going to. By the time he dropped Anna at school, he was already running through the day's work in his head. He drove an old pickup with a dent in the door he had never bothered to fix. His toolbox was worn smooth at the corners. To anyone who didn't know him, he looked like exactly what he was on paper, an independent contractor with a truck and a trade. But if you walked into any hangar on the East Coast and asked the veterans who Raphael Williams was, the room changed. Apprentices went quiet to listen. A retired captain once drove 2 hours just to shake his hand after flying a plane Raphael had rebuilt from a wreck 3 years earlier. Inspectors who failed half the work they saw signed off on his without a second look. 22 years in restoration, and not one safety violation to his name. Executives didn't know him. Pilots did. And in this industry, that was the only opinion that had ever mattered to Raphael. He had turned down offers that would have doubled his income overnight, because every one of them came with a relocation clause, and Raphael wasn't interested in a paycheck that cost him dinner with his daughter. Carol Hill had never had to learn anyone's name to know whether she trusted them. She built that instinct running Hill Global Aviation, the company her father started, and she turned into one of the fastest growing names in private aviation. She was smart, and she knew it. She was rarely challenged in a room, partly because she was usually right, and partly because she didn't leave people much space to disagree with her. To Carol, image wasn't decoration, it was strategy. A company this size didn't get to look ordinary, and neither did anyone standing near it. Clients don't hand us billions because we meet the standard, she told her board just the previous month. They hand it to us because we look like we said it. Nobody in that room challenged her. Nobody in that company ever did. What she hadn't learned yet, because nothing had forced her to, was how expensive that instinct could get. 3 weeks before a set of investor meetings that could define the company's next decade, one of Hill Global's flagship jets was torn apart in a hangar accident. The damage was bad enough that 2 contractors took one look and walked back out to their cars. A third quoted a timeline that would blow past the investor meetings entirely. David Brooks, the maintenance director, didn't wait for Carol's approval to make a call most people in his position wouldn't dare make without it. He had seen this kind of damage before, and he had seen exactly one person walk into a wreck like this and walk out with something better than what was lost. He called Raphael before he even finished reading the damage report. Raphael didn't ask what it paid. He didn't ask who would be watching. He said he would come take a look, the same way he had said it 100 times before, and hung up already thinking through what the job would need. He had no idea that this one call was about to put his name in the mouth of every pilot at Hill Global Aviation, and in the middle of a fight he never asked to be part of. The next morning, Raphael parked his truck outside a hangar that had never seen anything like him roll through its gates. A few young employees clocked the dent in the door and the toolbox in his hand and traded a look. Somebody laughed under their breath. "That's the guy David hired?" Raphael didn't hear it, or didn't let it land. He picked up his toolbox, walked toward the wreck of a 9-figure aircraft like he had done this 1,000 times before, because he had, and got to work. If a man who had already lost more than most people could imagine, and still showed up every single day to do the job right, sounded like someone worth rooting for, you didn't just watch this story. You subscribed then, because Raphael was about to find out exactly what respect was worth at a company that hadn't learned to give it, and you were going to want to be there for every second of it. Raphael didn't touch a single tool for the first hour. He walked the aircraft twice, slow, running his palm along seams other men would have skipped straight past. A young mechanic named Isaiah watched from the tail end of the hangar, half expecting the new guy to pull out a torque wrench and start swinging. Instead, Raphael crouched by the wing root, pressed 2 fingers against a panel, and asked for a flashlight. "What are you looking for?" David asked, arms crossed, trying not to sound as nervous as he felt. "Something that shouldn't be there," Raphael said, and didn't explain further. By the time he finally spoke again, 40 minutes later, he wasn't talking about the accident at all. He wanted the maintenance logs going back 6 years. David hesitated only because nobody had ever asked for that much history on a repair this size, then pulled the files himself rather than waste time routing the request through 3 departments. What Raphael found buried in those records wasn't from the accident. It was older. A stress fracture along a support beam, hairline thin, the kind that got missed during routine inspection because nobody was looking for it unless they already suspected it was there. It had been sitting in that airframe for at least 2 years, quietly working its way toward becoming a real problem, and the accident just happened to crack it open enough for someone paying attention to notice. "If we just patch what broke in the accident and ignore this," Raphael told David, tapping the beam with the back of a wrench, "this plane fails again. Maybe not this year, but it fails." He walked David through the load stress and metal fatigue until the numbers stopped sounding abstract and started sounding like a countdown. David asked about cost and time, and Raphael told him the truth. Doing it right would take longer than anyone upstairs wanted to hear, but doing it wrong could cost them the plane. David didn't argue. He had seen enough contractors try to shortcut a repair to know the difference between someone rushing and someone being thorough, and this wasn't rushing. He signed off on the full rebuild before lunch. What followed were 3 weeks that blurred together the way real work did when nobody was counting hours. Raphael was in the hangar before the sun, and long after most of the staff had gone home. He sketched structural diagrams on the back of old work orders because it was faster than waiting for someone to print new paper. He welded until his hands shook, tested, found the weld wasn't quite right, and did it again without complaining to anyone about it. Anna came by most afternoons after school, backpack still on, and set up her homework on an overturned crate near the tail section. She had learned not to interrupt him mid-weld, but the second he pulled his mask up, she was talking, telling him about a science project or a friend who had said something unkind at lunch. Some days she brought him a sandwich because she had noticed he forgot to eat when he was deep in a problem. He always acted surprised, and she always knew he was pretending. The hangar crew started to notice them together before they noticed the quality of Raphael's work. A senior mechanic named Priya mentioned to a coworker that she had never seen a father that patient with a 9-year-old after a 12-hour shift, and the coworker just nodded, because everyone was thinking it and nobody had said it out loud yet. One evening, a young apprentice watched Raphael help Anna with a math problem while still holding a torque wrench in his other hand, and muttered to nobody in particular that he hoped he turned out half that good someday. Carol had no idea any of this was happening. She was 3 floors up in the executive wing, buried in slide decks and pre-meeting calls with investors who wanted assurances the jet would be ready. She asked David for updates exactly twice that week, and both times the answer was the same. On schedule, better than expected. She didn't ask who was doing the work. It had never occurred to her that she should. By the second week, the skepticism in the hangar had curdled into something closer to respect. Inspectors who came in expecting to find shortcuts started finding precision instead. A structural engineer who initially questioned why an independent contractor was handling a job this size ended up staying late one night just to watch Raphael explain a repair technique nobody in the room had seen executed quite that way. He left without saying much, but the next morning he brought two of his own engineers back to watch again. Even the contractors who had turned the job down originally started hearing about it. One of them called David directly, half curious and half defensive, asking who exactly was running point on the Hill Global repair. David told him the truth. The contractor went quiet on the other end of the line for a second before saying, carefully, that he had heard the name before. By the end of the third week, the aircraft passed its first major structural inspection without a single flag. Not a conditional pass, not a pass with notes, clean. David stood in front of the plane for a long moment after the inspector left, running his hand along a panel that 3 weeks earlier had been twisted metal and exposed wiring. He thought about how close he came to losing this job, over a decision he would make again in a heartbeat. If Carol could see this, he said to Raphael, who was coiling a length of cable a few feet away, she'd understand exactly why I called you first. Raphael didn't answer right away. He had learned, over 22 years of doing this work, that results spoke louder than anything he could say about himself, and he had never needed anyone in a boardroom to confirm what the pilots already knew. She doesn't need to see it, he finally said. The plane will tell her everything she needs to know. David laughed, tired but genuine, and clapped him on the shoulder before heading toward the office to file the inspection paperwork. Neither of them knew that Carol had already cleared her calendar for the next morning. She was coming down to see the jet in person before the investor meetings, expecting to shake the hand of whichever prestigious aerospace firm pulled off what half the industry called impossible. She had no idea what she was about to walk into. Carol's car pulled into the hangar lot a few minutes before 9, trailed by 2 assistants and a photographer she had asked to hold off shooting until she said so. She was already picturing how this went. A handshake with whoever ran point on the repair, a few minutes of praise for the cameras, maybe a mention in the next quarter's investor update about the caliber of partners Hill Global worked with. She stepped through the side door into the hangar, expecting to see a name she recognized, a logo on a jacket, a team in matching polos representing some firm with a reputation to protect. Instead, she saw a man in stained coveralls kneeling beside the landing gear, a worn toolbox open beside him, grease along his forearms up past the elbow. For a second, she assumed he was cleanup crew and looked past him for whoever was actually in charge. "David," she said, scanning the hangar, "where's the team from the contractor?" David stepped forward, and something in his posture, a kind of careful pride, should have told her everything before he said a word. "Carol, this is Raphael Williams. He's the one who rebuilt the aircraft." Carol didn't move for a moment. She looked at Raphael the way a person looks at a math problem that didn't add up. Then she looked back at David. "He's independent," David said, filling the silence. "Every major firm we called either turned it down or wanted 6 months. Raphael had it structurally sound in 3 weeks. The inspection results are on your desk. You hired an independent contractor," Carol said slowly, "for a 9-figure aircraft, without running it by me. There wasn't time to wait on approvals. I made the call I thought would save the plane." Raphael hadn't said anything yet. He stood, wiped his hands on a rag from his back pocket, and offered a small nod toward Carol, the kind of respectful greeting he would give anyone he was meeting for the first time on a job. She didn't return it. Her eyes moved over his coveralls, his boots, the dent in the truck visible through the open hangar door, and something in her expression hardened into a decision she had already made before asking a single question about his work. "This isn't the image our company represents," she said, not quite to Raphael, not quite to David, more to the room at large. The hangar had gone quiet enough that the words carried farther than she probably intended. A few mechanics near the tail section stopped what they were doing. Isaiah, still holding a clipboard, glanced at Priya, and neither of them said anything. Carol asked David to walk with her toward the small conference room off the side of the hangar, the one used for quick inspection sign-offs. Raphael stayed where he was, not because he was told to, but because nobody had invited him to follow. Inside the glass-walled room, David laid out the invoice. It was fair, itemized, lower than what any of the firms who had declined the job would have charged for half the work. Carol looked at it for a long moment. "I'm not authorizing this," she said. "Carol, the work is done. It's certified. Independent inspectors signed off on it this morning. The company never approved this contractor. I can't put my name on a payment for someone who was never vetted through proper channels. He saved us 6 months and probably saved the investor meetings. What exactly needs vetting?" Carol's jaw tightened. "You went around me, David. You brought a stranger into this building to work on a flagship aircraft, and you didn't think that warranted a conversation first. I thought getting the plane fixed warranted moving fast. You're suspended, pending review," she said, and the words landed flat and final. "I need to understand how a decision like this gets made without anyone above you signing off." Through the glass wall, the hangar had gone almost completely still. Word traveled fast in a room full of people who had spent 3 weeks watching one man work harder than anyone they had seen in years. Raphael heard enough of it, not through the wall, but through the faces of everyone around him, to understand exactly what had happened. He didn't wait for someone to come tell him officially. He started gathering his tools, unhurried, the same steady motion he brought to everything. David stepped back out of the conference room a moment later, jaw tight, and found Raphael already halfway to the door with his toolbox in hand. "Raphael, I'm sorry. This isn't how this was supposed to go." "You don't have anything to apologize for," Raphael said. "You believed in the work. That's more than a lot of people ever give somebody like me. She's making a mistake. Maybe. That's hers to carry, not mine." Raphael extended a hand, and David shook it, holding on a second longer than a normal handshake usually lasted. "Thank you for calling me first." He picked up his toolbox and walked toward the exit, past the aircraft he spent 3 weeks rebuilding from a wreck into something better than new, past mechanics who watched him do it, past an entire hangar that knew exactly what just happened, even if nobody said it out loud. Isaiah pulled his cap off as Raphael passed. Priya did the same a second later, without either of them planning it, without a word exchanged between them. One by one, down the line, caps came off. It wasn't a protest. Nobody raised their voice. It was something quieter than that, a room full of people who understood skill and integrity when they saw it, paying respect the only way they knew how in a moment nobody expected to matter this much. Carol stepped out of the conference room in time to see it, a hangar full of grown men and women standing in silence as a mechanic in stained coveralls walked out the door with his dignity fully intact and his pay still sitting unsigned on a desk behind her. She didn't understand what she just watched. Not yet. But something about the stillness in that hangar followed her all the way back up to her office, and it didn't leave. If you had ever watched someone stay graceful in a moment, that would have broken most people. You already knew Raphael deserved better than what just happened to him. You didn't scroll past this one. You subscribed then, because Carol Hill was about to find out exactly what it cost to disrespect a man an entire industry already trusted, and you didn't want to miss a second of what happened next. By Monday morning, the restored jet sat gleaming under the hangar lights, every panel aligned, every weld invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Independent inspectors ran their final checks and signed off without a single note. Chief maintenance officers who stopped by out of curiosity left impressed enough to ask David, quietly, who trained the man who did this work. David wasn't there to answer. He was home, phone off, working through the kind of suspension that wasn't really about policy so much as it was about a CEO needing somewhere to put her discomfort. Carol had told herself the matter was settled. The plane was fixed. The invoice, unsigned, sat in a drawer she hadn't opened since Friday. As far as she was concerned, the story ended there. It didn't. Captain Grant Delgado was scheduled to fly the jet on its first post-repair run. a short hop to pick up 2 board members ahead of the investor meetings. He arrived early, the way he always did, and walked the aircraft before boarding, running through his own checklist out of habit, built over 18 years in the cockpit, a habit that had never once let him down. He stopped near the tail section, studying the maintenance signature stamped into the repair log. He recognized the certification number before he even read the name attached to it. Raphael Williams, he said out loud, to no one in particular, and something in his expression shifted. A ground crew member nearby glanced over. "You know him?" "Everybody who's flown long enough knows him." Grant ran a thumb along the edge of the log. He pulled a charter jet back from a bird strike nobody thought was survivable, 6-7 years ago. Worked through the night so a family could still make a funeral the next morning. Never billed them extra for the rush. He wasn't the only one. Word moved through the pilot community the way it always did. Not through headlines or press releases, but through conversations in break rooms and crew lounges and quiet phone calls between people who had trusted each other with their lives for years. A senior captain named Whitfield remembered Raphael mentoring his nephew through an aviation apprenticeship without ever asking for anything in return. A chief engineer recalled a repair Raphael did on his own time because the original contractor's mistake would have grounded a medevac plane for a week. None of these stories were ever public. Nobody wrote them down. They existed the way reputations existed inside industries built on trust, passed person to person, verified by results instead of headlines. A mechanic's name meant something in aviation precisely because it couldn't be bought, dressed up, or manufactured overnight. It had to be earned one repair at a time, over years, with nothing to fall back on but the work itself. By Tuesday, most of the flight crews scheduled anywhere near Hill Global Aviation knew exactly what happened in that hangar on Friday. Nobody organized anything. There was no meeting, no petition, no coordinated effort. It happened the way water found the same level in connected pools, quietly and all at once. If Raphael wasn't good enough to trust with a plane this size, one pilot said to another over coffee, David never would have called him first. And if the company can't be bothered to pay a man who saved them 6 figures and a scheduling disaster, what does that tell you about how they'll treat the rest of us when something goes wrong? The question didn't need an answer. Everyone in that conversation already had one. Grant spent Tuesday evening turning the situation over in his head before he called the crew scheduling desk. He asked a simple question. Had Raphael Williams been paid in full for his work on the aircraft he was scheduled to fly tomorrow? The scheduler didn't know. Nobody at his level would. He promised to find out and called back an hour later with silence dressed up as an answer, some vague line about the matter being under internal review. Grant didn't need more than that. He thought about every captain he had ever known who trusted a mechanic's signature the same way they trusted an engine gauge, without a second thought, because the alternative was unthinkable. He thought about what it meant to fly an aircraft rebuilt by a man the company humiliated and never paid. It wasn't about the quality of the repair. He had no doubts about that. It was about what kind of company asked him to represent it in the sky while it treated the person who kept that sky safe like he didn't matter. He had flown for outfits that cut corners before, and he had watched what happened when a company started treating safety as a line item instead of a promise. Wednesday morning, the day of the scheduled flight, Grant arrived at the hangar in his uniform, flight bag over his shoulder, and stood near the aircraft for a long moment before setting the bag down on a nearby cart instead of carrying it aboard. A ground coordinator noticed and walked over. "Everything okay, Captain?" "I need confirmation that Raphael Williams was paid in full for this repair before I take this aircraft anywhere." "I don't have that information." "Then I'm not flying it today." He said it the way he would report a mechanical issue, calm, factual, nothing dramatic in his tone, because to him, this wasn't drama. It was a decision built on the same instinct that had kept him alive in a cockpit for 18 years. If something didn't check out, you didn't take off. He picked up his flight bag from the cart, walked to the small crew office, and started the paperwork to formally decline the assignment. Behind him, the aircraft sat perfect, fully restored, structurally flawless, and going nowhere. Word of his refusal reached the scheduling office within the hour. It reached Carol's desk not long after that, framed as a routine staffing issue, a captain unavailable, a replacement needed by end of day. Nobody upstairs understood yet what was actually happening. By Thursday, Hill Global Aviation had a scheduling problem nobody in the executive wing knew how to name yet. A replacement captain was called in to cover the flight Grant declined. He reviewed the same maintenance log, recognized the same name, and made the same call within the hour. Scheduling tried again. A third captain, this one flown in from a satellite hangar 2 states over, specifically requested because nobody local seemed available. He looked over the paperwork for less than 10 minutes before politely informing the coordinator that he wouldn't be taking the assignment either. Nobody was coordinating this. That was what made it impossible to fix with a memo or a policy update. Each pilot reached the same conclusion on their own, based on the same facts, the way separate witnesses to an accident somehow described it the same way without ever comparing notes. There was no ringleader to call into an office, no single complaint to smooth over. Just a slow, quiet consensus spreading through people who didn't need a meeting to agree on something they already knew in their gut. By Friday afternoon, the jet that took Raphael 3 weeks to rebuild from a wreck sat exactly where it sat the day the last inspector signed off on it. Untouched, unflown. A 9-figure asset doing nothing but occupying floor space, while 2 international investor meetings inched closer on the calendar. Executives started noticing. A vice president in charter operations mentioned to Carol's assistant that clients were asking why a specific tail number kept getting pulled from their itinerary. A senior account manager reported that one longtime client, a private equity partner who had flown with Hill Global for 6 years, had quietly started making inquiries with a competing charter service. Carol insisted, more than once, that the staffing issue was temporary. A scheduling hiccup, she told her assistant to loop in HR and figure out why so many captains were suddenly unavailable for one specific aircraft. The explanation that came back didn't match anything HR had a form for. Every pilot who declined gave some version of the same reason, phrased carefully enough to avoid sounding insubordinate, but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Personal scheduling conflict, not comfortable with the assignment at this time, prefer not to say. By the weekend, 4 separate captains had turned down the same flight. 2 more had quietly requested reassignment away from any Hill Global aircraft entirely, citing reasons vague enough to survive HR review, but specific enough that everyone in the crew lounge knew exactly what they meant. Investors started asking sharper questions. One board member called Carol directly, his tone carrying the particular patience of a man used to being taken seriously, and asked plainly why the flagship aircraft wasn't in the air yet. Carol gave him the same answer she had given everyone, a staffing matter, under review, resolved shortly. He didn't sound convinced. She wasn't either, and the silence after she hung up felt longer than the call itself. By Monday morning, the board scheduled an emergency call. Carol walked into it expecting to explain a scheduling delay. She walked out having been asked, by 3 separate directors, some version of the same uncomfortable question: what exactly happened between her and the contractor who repaired that aircraft? She had no good answer. She had an invoice she never signed, a maintenance director she suspended for hiring the one person capable of saving the plane, and a growing list of captains who wouldn't go near it. None of that sounded like a staffing issue when she said it out loud to people who were starting to lose patience. That afternoon, she finally called David. He picked up on the second ring, his voice careful, the kind of careful a person uses when they're not sure whether the call is good news or worse. "I need you to explain something to me," Carol said. "Why does every pilot in this company seem to know who Raphael Williams is?" David was quiet for a moment before he answered honestly, without softening it for her. He told her about the charter jet and the bird strike years ago, about the medevac plane he fixed on his own time, about the apprentices he had trained without ever asking the company for a dime in return, about a reputation built over 2 decades that no amount of money or title could manufacture, because it was earned one repair, one act of integrity, at a time, in 100 hangars most executives would never set foot in. "These pilots trust his signature more than they trust half the executives in this building," David said. You didn't just insult a contractor, Carol. You insulted someone they'd trust their lives to before they'd trust most of the people in that boardroom. Carol didn't respond right away. For the first time since Raphael walked out of that hangar, she started to understand that this was never about a scheduling delay. That evening, alone in her office long after everyone else had left, she asked her assistant for Raphael's complete contractor file, the one she never bothered to look at before deciding he wasn't good enough to stand near her company's aircraft. It arrived within the hour, a folder thicker than she expected for someone she had dismissed in under a minute. She read through certifications, commendations, letters from pilots she recognized by name. 22 years of work, not one safety violation. References that read less like paperwork and more like testimony from people who owed him something they couldn't quite put into words. Near the back of the file, tucked between two inspection reports, she found a photograph she wasn't expecting. Raphael, younger, standing beside a little girl who couldn't be more than 4 or 5, both of them grinning at a hand-built model airplane held up between them like a trophy neither of them wanted to put down. On the back, in handwriting that had clearly been written slowly, carefully, by someone who meant every word, was a short note. For my daughter Anna, because every dream deserves wings. Carol sat with the photograph for a long time after the office had gone completely quiet, the hangar lights outside her window the only thing still burning at that hour, and she started to wonder, for the first time in longer than she would like to admit, whether she had just made the worst mistake of her career. Carol didn't sleep that night. She sat in her office long after the cleaning crew had come and gone, the photograph of Raphael and Anna propped against her desk lamp, and turned the same question over and over without landing anywhere close to comfortable. How many times had she done this before, decided who someone was before they had said a single word, and never once had it come back to cost her anything? By morning, she still hadn't slept, but she had made a decision. She asked her assistant to pull David back from suspension and called him into her office before most of the building had arrived for the day. David walked in expecting another round of the same conversation, another closed door, another version of the suspension he had been living with for over a week. Instead, Carol slid the photograph across the desk toward him. "Tell me about him," she said. "Not the resume." "Him." David sat down slowly, studying her for a moment before he started talking. He told her about job offers Raphael had turned down over the years, some of them from firms that would have doubled or tripled what he made now, every single one of them requiring relocation. Raphael turned all of them down without much deliberation, because moving would have meant pulling Anna away from the only school, the only friends, the only life she had known since her mother died. "He doesn't chase the biggest paycheck," David said. "He chases the job that lets him be home when she gets off the bus. I've watched him say no to opportunities most people in this industry would sell a kidney for, and he never once looked like he was making a sacrifice. Like it wasn't even a real choice for him, like there was nothing to weigh in the first place." Carol listened without interrupting, something she wasn't used to doing. 22 years, David continued. Not one violation. Pilots who won't fly with anyone else's signature on a repair. And you looked at him for maybe 10 seconds and decided none of that mattered. He didn't say it cruelly. That almost made it worse. Carol spent the rest of the morning unable to concentrate on anything on her calendar. By early afternoon, she canceled 2 meetings, got in her car, and drove to an address David gave her, without asking many questions about why she needed it. The neighborhood wasn't what she expected, though she wasn't entirely sure what she did expect. Small houses, close together, the kind of street where people knew their neighbors' names and waved from porches without needing a reason. Raphael's house sat near the end of the block, modest, well-kept, a porch light flickering slightly even though it was still daylight. She saw them before they saw her. Raphael and Anna were in the front yard, hunched over a wooden model airplane balanced on a folding table. Wings that kept sliding loose no matter how many times Raphael repositioned them. Anna laughed every time it happened, not frustrated, just delighted by the challenge of it, and Raphael laughed along with her, patient in a way Carol didn't often see from anyone, let alone a man she humiliated in front of his entire industry less than 2 weeks ago. Carol sat in her car for several minutes before she could make herself get out. When she finally approached, Anna spotted her first and waved, friendly, unguarded, with no idea who this stranger was or what she did to her father. Raphael looked up, and for a brief second something flickered across his face. Not anger exactly, more like quiet surprise that she had come at all. "Mrs. Hill," he said, setting down a small tube of wood glue. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to come," Carol admitted, and it was the most honest sentence she had said out loud in days. Anna, unbothered by the tension neither adult was naming, held up the model airplane proudly. "We're building this for my science fair. The wings keep falling off because I glued them wrong the first time, but Daddy says that's okay because you learn more from fixing mistakes than getting it right the first time." Carol managed a small smile. "Sounds like good advice." "My daddy fixes airplanes so families can get home safely," Anna said, matter of fact, the way kids say things that adults spend years working up the nerve to say. "He says airplanes are only safe because people choose to do the right thing, even when nobody's watching." The sentence landed somewhere Carol wasn't braced for. She looked at Raphael, and he didn't add anything to what Anna said, didn't soften it or explain it away, just let his daughter's words sit there, exactly as honest as she meant them. Carol opened her mouth to apologize, had the words half-formed, but nothing came out that felt adequate for what she actually did. Instead, she just stood there for a moment, watching a father and daughter build something together out of wood glue and patience, in a yard that had more warmth in it than her entire executive floor. "I owe you an apology," she finally managed. "A real one. Not today, standing here. I need to do it properly." Raphael studied her for a long moment. Not unkind, just careful. "I appreciate that." Before Carol left, Anna ran inside and came back out with a second, smaller model airplane. This one finished, wings steady, paint still slightly uneven in places. She held it out. "You can have this one. Sometimes fixing something takes more than glue." Carol took it carefully, unsure what to say, and thanked her before walking back to her car, the small airplane held with more care than she had held anything all week. She didn't turn the engine on right away. She sat there instead, the small wooden airplane resting in her lap, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she started to cry, quietly, in a parked car outside a house that just showed her exactly what she had been too proud to see. The board meeting Carol scheduled for Thursday morning wasn't the kind she was used to running. She usually walked into these rooms with a deck already loaded, numbers lined up to support whatever direction she had already decided on. This time she walked in with nothing prepared, because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't have a plan. She only had the truth, and she wasn't sure yet how much of it she was ready to say out loud. The chief financial officer went first, and the numbers he laid out were worse than Carol expected. 2 international contracts, delayed indefinitely. A third client, the private equity partner who had flown with Hill Global for 6 years, had moved his business to a competing charter service entirely. Projected losses for the quarter, if the pattern continued, ran into 8 figures, and that number didn't even account for the reputational damage spreading through an industry that talked to itself far more than most executives realized. "This isn't a scheduling problem," he said, not unkindly, just factually. "This is a confidence problem, and it started the day our flagship aircraft went dark." A board member near the end of the table, a woman named Whitfield, who had sat on this board longer than Carol had run the company, leaned forward. "We aren't losing business because of some independent mechanic, Carol. We're losing business because of how we treated him." Nobody argued with her. Nobody had to. Carol sat with that for a long moment before she spoke. She didn't defend herself, didn't offer the version of events that made her look reasonable, the one she had been rehearsing in her head since Friday. Instead, she told them plainly what happened. She walked into a hangar, expecting to shake hands with a prestigious firm. She saw a man in stained coveralls instead, and before she had asked a single question about his qualifications, she decided he wasn't good enough to be near her company's aircraft. She refused to authorize his payment. She suspended the maintenance director, who trusted his instincts more than her assumptions. And an entire industry, one built on trust and reputation, and years of quiet integrity she never bothered to look for, responded exactly the way she should have expected, if she had taken 30 seconds to actually see the man standing in front of her. The room stayed quiet through most of it. Nobody interrupted. David, who had been sitting near the back since being reinstated that morning, finally spoke once Carol finished. He didn't defend himself either, and he didn't attack her. He just told the board something that had clearly been sitting in him for days. This company wasn't built only by executives in this room, he said. It was built by the mechanics, the inspectors, the pilots, the cleaners, the contractors who show up before sunrise and believe their work matters even when nobody upstairs is watching them do it. Raphael never asked for special treatment. He asked for fairness. That's all any of them have ever asked for. A few heads around the table lowered. Even the board members who backed Carol's original decision seemed to understand, sitting in this room with the numbers laid bare in front of them, that this was never really about company image at all. The meeting ran long, longer than any board call Carol could remember, moving through damage control and public relations strategy and questions about liability nobody had clean answers for yet. But none of it felt like the real conversation to Carol. The real conversation happened days ago, in a front yard, with a 9-year-old holding up a model airplane and telling her more truth in one sentence than an entire quarter of financial reports. That evening, once the meeting finally ended and the last board member had left the building, Carol didn't go home. She drove to the hangar instead, empty now except for the restored jet sitting exactly where it had been sitting for over a week, untouched, unflown, gleaming under lights nobody had bothered to turn off. She walked around it slowly, the way she imagined Raphael must have walked around it that first morning, running her hand along a panel that used to be twisted metal and exposed wiring, before he spent 3 weeks turning it into something better than new. Every inch of it represented work she dismissed in under a minute. Every clean weld and perfectly aligned seam was proof of exactly what she refused to see standing right in front of her, dressed in stained coveralls and holding a toolbox that had earned more respect than her own name did. She thought about her father, who built this company from almost nothing, who used to say that a business is only as strong as the people willing to stake their name on it. She wondered what he would have thought, watching his daughter humiliate the one person who saved this aircraft from becoming an expensive pile of scrap metal, all because he showed up in coveralls instead of a suit. She trusted the plane completely. She never once thought to trust the man who rebuilt it. Standing there alone in the quiet hangar, surrounded by an aircraft nobody would fly, and a reputation she had spent weeks quietly dismantling, Carol finally understood what David and the board and her own conscience had all been trying to tell her in different ways. This was never a staffing issue, and it was never really about an unpaid invoice. It was about a woman who built her entire career on reading people at a glance, finally meeting someone she read completely wrong, and refusing for too long to admit it. She took out her phone and called every board member individually, one after another, until it was well past midnight. "Tomorrow morning," she told each of them, the same 4 words repeated until they stopped sounding like an apology and started sounding like a decision. "We're fixing this." If it took a company on the verge of collapse for a CEO to finally see what an entire industry already knew, you didn't wait until the next scroll to find out if she meant it. You subscribed then, because Raphael had waited long enough for the apology he deserved, and you didn't want to miss the moment this company finally made it right. The main hangar had never held a company meeting like this one. By 9 the next morning, every available employee had been asked to gather beneath the wings of the very aircraft that had been sitting grounded for over a week, mechanics standing shoulder to shoulder with pilots, office staff clustered near engineers, everyone trying to guess what was coming, and mostly landing somewhere between confused and cautiously hopeful. Even the security guards who usually stayed near the entrance drifted closer, sensing this was the kind of announcement worth actually watching. Carol stepped onto a small raised platform near the nose of the jet without a single note card in her hand. She had given hundreds of presentations in this company, always polished, always rehearsed, down to the pause between sentences. This one she hadn't practiced at all, because for the first time she wasn't trying to sound like a leader. She was just trying to tell the truth. 2 weeks ago, she began, I made a decision that I've spent every day since regretting more than the last. The hangar went quiet in a way it rarely did, even during safety briefings. She told them everything, without softening a single detail. She walked into this hangar expecting to meet a prestigious contractor and instead found a man in stained coveralls who had already saved this aircraft and this company weeks ahead of any reasonable timeline. She judged him before she had asked him a single question about his work. She refused to authorize his payment. She suspended a maintenance director for trusting his instincts over her assumptions when his instincts turned out to be exactly right. I let what someone looked like tell me what they were worth, she said, and I was wrong in every possible way a person can be wrong. She turned to David, standing near the front of the crowd, and apologized to him directly, publicly, without the careful corporate language she had spent her career perfecting. She told him his judgment saved this company, and her judgment nearly cost it everything. Then she asked if Raphael was in the building. A ripple moved through the crowd. Heads turned. Near the back, half hidden behind two mechanics who had worked beside him for the past 3 weeks, Raphael stood with his toolbox at his feet, clearly not expecting to be called forward, clearly weighing whether he even wanted to be. David caught his eye and gave him a small nod, the kind that said more than words would. Raphael stepped forward slowly, walking through a crowd that parted for him the same way it did the day he walked out, except this time nobody was laughing, and nobody was looking away. He climbed onto the platform beside Carol, toolbox left behind on the hangar floor, and stood there with the same steady calm he had carried through every version of this story so far. The same calm that got him through weeks of Greece and long nights, and one very public humiliation. Carol turned to face him directly. I owe you more than an apology, but I want to start there. I'm sorry for how I treated you, for what I assumed about you before I ever gave you the chance to prove it wrong, for the fact that it took a company nearly falling apart before I was willing to see what everyone in this hangar already knew. Raphael didn't say anything right away. He looked out at the crowd, at faces he had worked beside for weeks, at a room full of people who removed their caps in silence the last time he walked through it. Carol continued before he could respond, laying out what she had brought with her. Full payment for the original repair, released that morning, interest for the delay, calculated to the day. A bonus substantial enough that even the finance officer standing near the platform raised an eyebrow. A written, formal apology that would go into Raphael's permanent contractor file, alongside every commendation he had earned that Carol never bothered to read until it was almost too late. David's full reinstatement, backdated, with a formal note in his file commending the judgment that saved the company an aircraft worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. She wasn't finished. New contractor protection policies, effective immediately, guaranteeing that no independent tradesperson working with Hill Global Aviation could be dismissed, delayed, or denied payment without documented cause reviewed by more than one executive. An anonymous reporting system for anyone who felt they had been judged unfairly because of how they looked rather than what they had done. Mandatory leadership training for every executive in the company, herself included, focused on evaluating performance instead of appearance, starting the following Monday with no exceptions. Applause started somewhere near the back of the hangar and spread forward. Not the polite applause of a routine announcement, but something warmer, something that sounded like relief finding somewhere to land. Employees weren't clapping because their CEO gave a good speech. They were clapping because, for the first time in longer than most of them could remember, she actually became one. Raphael finally spoke, his voice steady, carrying without needing to be raised. Respect grows when we're willing to admit we're wrong, he said. That takes more courage than most people ever show. I appreciate you showing it today. There was no bitterness in his voice, no edge, nothing that suggested he had been quietly waiting for this moment, to make her feel small, the way she once made him feel. Just grace, plain and unforced. The same grace he carried out of this hangar 2 weeks ago, when he had every reason not to. Several people near the front wiped their eyes. Isaiah, standing close to the platform, didn't bother hiding it. As the meeting started to break apart, small groups forming, conversations picking back up, several pilots made their way toward Raphael before he could even step down from the platform. One of them, a captain who had flown for Hill Global for nearly a decade, shook his hand firmly and glanced toward the restored jet still sitting grounded a few yards away. "Looks like we've got somewhere to fly tomorrow," he said, and for the first time in 2 weeks, that sentence sounded like the truth. The next morning, Grant arrived at the hangar before his shift technically started, flight bag over his shoulder, the same bag he had set down on a cart a week earlier instead of carrying it aboard. This time, he walked straight to where Raphael was running a final check on the aircraft and extended his hand without much preamble. "Wanted to be the one to fly her," he said. "Figured that was only right, given everything." Raphael shook his hand, no lingering resentment in his grip, nothing that suggested he was keeping score of who stood where a week ago. "Appreciate that, Captain." One by one, other pilots started arriving, some scheduled for the day, others simply showing up because word traveled fast in a hangar and nobody wanted to miss this particular morning. The mood was different from anything the building had held in weeks. Nobody was celebrating a repaired aircraft anymore. That part was never in question. What they were celebrating was something harder to fix than metal and wiring, the kind of trust that had to be earned back one honest gesture at a time. By mid-morning, the aircraft taxied toward the runway, with Grant in the cockpit, David watching from just outside the hangar doors, Carol standing a short distance behind him, close enough to see everything, but far enough to understand this moment didn't belong to her. Raphael stood near the front of the small crowd that had gathered, arms crossed, watching the plane he pulled back from a wreck lift smoothly into a clear morning sky, the same sky he had spent 22 years trusting other people to fly through safely. Applause broke out across the tarmac, scattered at first, then louder. Nobody was clapping because the engines worked. Everybody there understood exactly what was actually taking off. David turned to Raphael as the jet climbed and banked east. "Feels different watching it go up this time." "It always did fly the same," Raphael said. "Just took everybody else a minute to trust it." He said it without any bite in his tone, just the plain observation of a man who had spent his whole career watching people come around eventually. In the weeks that followed, people around Raphael started suggesting the obvious things. A bigger house, somewhere with more than one bathroom, and a yard that didn't back up against a chain-link fence. A newer truck, something without a dent in the door, and rust creeping along the wheel wells. A proper workshop with real square footage instead of the cramped garage bay he had worked out of for over a decade. Raphael listened to all of it politely and did none of it, the same way he had turned down every offer that ever asked him to trade what mattered for something that only looked like it mattered. Instead, he paid off medical bills that had been sitting unpaid since his wife passed, debts he had been quietly chipping away at for years without telling anyone how much they weighed on him. He set up an education fund for Anna, enough to cover whatever she decided she wanted to study, wherever that ended up taking her. He fixed the roof on his small house, the one that had leaked into the same corner of the kitchen every spring for the past 3 years. And he expanded his cramped workshop just enough to fit 2 more workbenches, because he had decided to start formally training young mechanics who couldn't afford the aviation schools that shaped his own early career. "Knowledge is the best investment I can leave behind," he told David one afternoon, watching 2 teenage apprentices struggle through a basic hydraulics lesson with more enthusiasm than skill. "Money runs out. What you teach somebody doesn't." David didn't argue with him. He had learned by now that arguing with Raphael's instincts was usually a losing bet. Carol, meanwhile, was becoming someone her own employees were still adjusting to. She started sitting in on maintenance department meetings she used to skip entirely, asking questions about the actual work instead of just the numbers attached to it. She personally greeted new contractors before their first day, learning their names before their titles, something that would have struck her as beneath her a month earlier. She walked the hangar floor more than she sat in her office, and the employees who used to go quiet when she passed now nodded, sometimes even stopped to talk, in a way that would have been unthinkable when this story started. It wasn't a perfect transformation. She still caught herself, occasionally, making a snap judgment about someone before she had given them a fair chance, and she had learned to notice it now, to pause and correct course before the assumption calcified into a decision she couldn't take back. Growth like that didn't happen in a single dramatic speech, no matter how sincere it was in the moment. It happened slowly, in 100 small choices nobody else was watching her make, on ordinary days that never made it into any company memo. Weeks later, Anna's school held its annual science fair, and Raphael sat in a folding chair near the back of a crowded gymnasium, watching his daughter stand proudly beside the finished model airplane she had spent months perfecting. Wings finally steady, paint even, every detail exactly the way she wanted it. She explained the aerodynamics to a panel of judges with more confidence than most adults managed in a boardroom, and when one judge asked what inspired the project, Anna didn't hesitate. "My dad taught me that fixing things starts with your heart," she said. "The rest is just tools." Raphael watched from his chair, throat tight in a way he didn't bother hiding. A few rows over, unexpected but not unwelcome, Carol sat quietly in the audience, having asked Raphael weeks earlier if it would be all right to attend, understanding it wasn't hers to assume. She watched Anna field questions with a poise that seemed to have skipped several years of typical childhood shyness entirely, and when Anna won first place in her age category, Carol clapped along with everyone else, genuinely, without an ounce of performance in it. Afterward, in the parking lot, Anna spotted Carol near her car and walked over, ribbons still pinned proudly to her jacket. "Thank you for coming," Anna said. "Daddy said you might not, but I'm glad you did." "I wouldn't have missed it," Carol said, and meant it. Anna studied her for a moment, the way kids sometimes do when they're deciding whether an adult had actually changed or just gotten better at pretending. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because she smiled and headed back toward her father, who was waiting by the entrance, with the small pride only a parent watching their kid succeed can carry. Carol watched them walk off together, and for a moment, standing alone in a school parking lot with the evening light fading behind her, she allowed herself something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not pride in a deal closed or a quarter met, something quieter. Something closer to the beginning of understanding what actually mattered, and how close she came to never learning it at all. 6 months passed, and Hill Global Aviation started becoming known throughout the industry for something nobody would have predicted the year before. Not the size of its fleet, not the exclusivity of its client list. Integrity, of all things, the kind that spread through an industry the same way word of Raphael's mistreatment once did, quietly, person to person, until it became something people simply knew, without remembering exactly where they first heard it. Other aviation companies started reaching out to David, now officially Director of Technical Operations, asking how Hill Global built its contractor protection policies and whether similar frameworks might work at their own hangars. He walked them through it patiently every time, always ending the conversation the same way. "None of this started as policy," he told them. "It started because we almost lost everything by not respecting the people who do the actual work." Employee morale climbed to numbers the Human Resources Department had never recorded before, not because pay increased dramatically or perks multiplied, but because people who showed up every day finally felt like their work was seen for what it was. Turnover among mechanics and ground crew dropped sharply. Job applications from experienced tradespeople, the kind who could work anywhere and chose carefully, started listing Hill Global as a preferred employer, something unheard of a year earlier. Raphael's life, meanwhile, hadn't changed nearly as much as anyone might expect. He still drove the same old pickup, the dent in the door left exactly where it had always been, because he had never seen much point in fixing something that still ran fine. He still wore coveralls that ended each day stained with grease, still refused shortcuts on any job that crossed his workbench, still showed up before sunrise out of habit rather than obligation. What had changed was the line of people who wanted to learn from him. Young mechanics traveled from other states, sometimes further, hoping to spend a season working under someone whose signature on a repair still meant more to pilots than most corporate guarantees ever could. He took on as many as his small, expanded workshop could hold, teaching them the same patience and precision that took him 2 decades to build, refusing to let any of them cut a corner just because a deadline felt tight. Among pilots, his name carried the same weight it always did, if not more. New captains heard the story before they ever met him in person, passed along the way all the best reputations are, through people who were actually there, or knew someone who was. Anna, now closer to 10 than 9, had started telling anyone who asked that she wanted to become an aerospace engineer someday. Not because airplanes looked impressive climbing into the sky, though she still watched everyone that passed overhead with the same wonder she had at 5. She wanted to build things that kept families safe, the way her father had for as long as she could remember. "I want people to trust what I build," she told him one evening, working through a physics assignment at the kitchen table while he cleaned up from dinner. "The way they trust you." Raphael set down the dish towel and sat across from her for a moment. "Trust doesn't come from being smart, though you're plenty of that. It comes from doing right by people even when it costs you something. Remember that more than any formula they teach you." Anna nodded, like she was filing the advice away somewhere permanent, the way she did with most things her father told her. Carol's transformation, meanwhile, became something she started speaking about openly, though never in a way that turned her mistake into a polished redemption story for applause. At the company's annual leadership conference, standing in front of a room full of new executives from Hill Global and several partner companies, she told the story plainly, the way David once told the board, without softening the parts that made her look bad. "I almost destroyed everything this company stood for," she said, "because I judged a man's worth by his appearance before I bothered to learn anything about his character. I want every person in this room to understand that the cost of that kind of judgment isn't abstract. It's measured in contracts lost, trust broken, and people who deserved better than what I gave them." She paused, looking out at faces that were listening more closely than they usually did during these kinds of talks. "The most expensive mistake I ever made wasn't a bad business decision. It was deciding I already knew someone's value before I ever asked them a single question." The room rose to applause, not because she delivered a flawless speech, but because everyone in it recognized something rare, a leader choosing accountability over image, in an industry that usually rewarded the opposite. Raphael never sought recognition for any of it, never gave interviews, never let the story turn him into something bigger than what he had always been, a father who showed up, a mechanic who did the work right, a man who chose dignity over revenge, when revenge would have been easy and understandable. He simply kept being the same person he was before any of this happened, which turned out to be the whole point all along. Carol still kept the small wooden airplane Anna handed her that afternoon in the front yard, sitting on the corner of her desk where she could see it during every difficult decision that crossed her path. It reminded her every single day that leadership started with seeing the person standing in front of you before anything else, before their title, their clothes, their resume, or anything else that used to matter more to her than it ever should have. The final image of this story returned to where it started, in a modest front yard as evening settled in. Raphael and Anna standing together watching a jet pass overhead, its lights blinking steadily against a darkening sky. Anna tilted her head back, still amazed by it after all these years, the way children stay amazed by things adults eventually stop noticing. "The strongest wings aren't built in factories, sweetheart," Raphael told her, watching the plane disappear past the tree line. Anna looked up at him, waiting. "They're built every time someone chooses honesty over pride," he said, "kindness over prejudice, and character over appearances." The aircraft faded into the distance, and the story closed on one truth that took an entire industry, a stubborn CEO, and one quiet father to prove. Respect could never be demanded by power. It had to be earned through humility, integrity, and the courage to treat every person with dignity, whether they were wearing a tailored suit or stained coveralls. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If this story meant something to you, I'd really love for you to subscribe. Before you go, leave a comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I read your comments, and I always enjoy seeing your thoughts and perspectives. If you're ready for another unforgettable story, just tap the next video on your screen. I'll see you there.